Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Center for the Book and DeKalb Library, welcome to another in our continuing series of author programs. Due to the global pandemic, we have taken our programming online, and we are so happy that you have welcomed us into your homes this evening. In a world that is full of turmoil right now, we are thankful that you chose to spend a few minutes with us and maybe have a little respite from the world outside, and just take a few minutes to center yourself around books and literature and community and fellowship. So we thank you so much for that. We'd also like to thank the DeKalb Library Foundation. They are, of course, paying for our Zoom account that the entire library system is using. The Library Foundation, of course, raises funds for the library that are not covered by the tax digest and pays for wonderful things like 1,000 books before kindergarten, our Take the Internet Home program, and all of our English as a second language classes, our summer reading programs. That's what they're really charged with doing. And we thank them so much for giving us the opportunity to meet you in your homes and take all of our programs online. Just a few things before we start this evening. Of course, if you have any questions following the presentation, you can either type them into the chat and I can read them for you, or feel free to raise your hand and Allie will recognize you and then turn your camera on and turn your microphone on, and you can ask your questions directly to our speaker. Do, though, keep your microphones muted during the presentation. It will just cut down on a lot of the background noise and some of the ringing feed sounds that you may sometimes encounter. I'd also like to thank, of course, First Baptist Church of Decatur. We've had a wonderful relationship with them for over 10 years now. Years ago, they allowed us to come into the church and start presenting author programs when we didn't really have the space to host folks like Anne Lamott, and Temple Grandin, and Khaled Hosseini, and really were able to expand our programming and our reach to so many more people. And they also created the conversations at First Baptist Ministry around these programs. And we are so very, very thankful for that, because they believe, like we do, that books start conversations, and conversations feed ideas, and maybe ideas and conversations can help change the world. So thank you to First Baptist Church, and thank you to Conversations at First Baptist Church for giving us this opportunity. Tonight, of course, we have a wonderful speaker. I've spent the day reading her book, For All Who Hunger. I do have to admit that I am a terrible, terrible reader on an iPad. This is because of the global pandemic. Publishing houses can't send us copies of books as easily as they used to for us to read beforehand. So I had a lot of PDFs and ebooks that I've been sent, and I just don't have the knack right now, but truly was entranced by what I was reading. It is a beautifully written book that, as you dig into it and you read the words that Emily has put on page, you can truly smell the baking bread and the wafts that come up from it. And then she truly gets into the heart of matters of building a community and building a church. And there's a great quote that I'm going to have terrible time finding because it's on one of the 3 devices that I have in front of me right now. But it was one of the pre-publicity quotes and a glowing review that said that this book does what so many churches and so many other books have tried to do but failed, and that was build a sense of community. And this is what Emily Scott has done for so many years. She's currently serves as the founding pastor of Dreams and Visions in Delaware, the Maryland Synod. But before that, from 2008 to 2017, she was the founding pastor of St. Lydia's Dinner Church in Brooklyn, where worship was conducted with a full meal shared around a dinner table. She and her congregation there were involved in combating police brutality, advocating for affordable housing, and organizing things with groups such as Faith in New York. Of course, this sparked a wider dinner church movement across America and is the model for new church starts. She is a graduate of the Yale Divinity School, where she received the Alumni Award for Distinction in Congregational Ministry in 2016. We are so very, very pleased to have her here this evening and share this wonderful memoir for all who hunger. Emily?
Thank you so much, Joe. What an introduction. And thanks so much for having me tonight. I'm really thrilled to be connecting with the work that you're doing. And also the work of First Baptist. It's incredible to be connected to new church communities that are working for justice and creating, I don't know, a sense of God's realm coming close to us. And so I'm very glad to be here with all of you. For All Who Hunger is a memoir about my time starting a new congregation as a church planter in Brooklyn, New York. And that congregation looked a little bit different than what we think of when we normally think of church. Instead of pews, there were tables. And instead of sitting and listening to a sermon, we sat around tables and shared a meal together, which is actually a practice that's derived from the earliest days of the Christian church, when that's what Christians did for several centuries, was to gather in people's homes and to share a meal where the bread was blessed and the cup was blessed. And eventually that kind of turned into our communion service. So tonight what I'd love to do is read you just a little bit from the beginning of the book that gives you a taste of what worship is like at St. Lydia's. And then I'm going to skip to a later chapter that's called Good Fridays, that kind of shows how, as our congregation grew, we developed and began to build relationships with our neighbors and were drawn into doing justice work, especially as the Black Lives Matter movement was beginning to get off the ground. So I'll begin at the beginning and then I'll tell you when I shift. In my hands, I hold a warm loaf of bread. I lift it to eye level so it can be seen. I sing words about how Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it. And as I sing, I rise up on my toes without realizing and close my eyes. No, keep them open, I remind myself, and look around the room at the 25 souls gathered there. We stand in a loose circle around 3 tables set for dinner. Mismatched napkins, forks and spoons, bowls filled with a green salad. Behind me, a pot of soup steams on the stovetop. The people's hands are lifted, held open in prayer like mine. Some have their eyes closed, faces tilted up in expectation. Others look back at me. The pastor has a privileged place in the gathering. We get to see our people at prayer. Their eyes are soft, waiting to receive. There is a tenderness to this moment, shot through with quotidian distractions. One congregant might fret about the testy arch of her supervisor's eyebrow when she asked for tomorrow off. Another prays fervently that his sister will stay clean this time, while another may just be realizing he forgot something at the grocery store. One has dredged himself from the quicksand of yet another depressive spell just to make it to church tonight. They are seeking love or sex, working 2 jobs to pay the rent, hungry for fulfillment, achievement, attention. I know their stories. Some grew up in poverty and others were raised to go to prep school. They dream of making it as an artist or just making it through the day. The song leader chants and we repeat together, "Glory to you forever and ever." Sometimes I wonder what pedestrians think as they pass by on the sidewalk and catch a glimpse of us inside. There we are, standing in a circle, singing to bread. I break the loaf. It's fresh from the oven and hot in my hands. When the crust cracks, steam escapes in curls, and I hear an audible sigh from the congregation. It is so good, this bread. It smells of rosemary and yeast. You feel it's breaking in your bones deep down somewhere. Holy food for holy people, I say, turning my gaze to the room. The eyes of the people shine. It's a moment outside of time. I turn to Malika, a congregant standing next to me, her dark hair swept up off her neck and held up with a beaded hairpiece, and take off a piece from the loaf. Malika, I say, pressing the piece into her hands, this is my body. I meet her eyes and then avert mine quickly. These are not easy words to say. They evoke a letting go of self, the smell of sex, an errant thought of cannibalism in the back of the mind. Malika takes the bread and eats it. The bread is passed from hand to hand. I collect the leftovers in a basket and pop it on the table closest to me, ready to be smeared with butter or dipped in soup. Then we all sit down to dinner. Sprinkled around these tables are geeks and geniuses, fools and misfits. Some of us have done a better job than others of climbing our way into something that might be identified as success in life or work. And now here we are, stumbling our way through dinner conversation that is the opposite of refined or easy. My table struggles along. There's a computer programmer visiting for the first time who blushes whenever someone makes eye contact with him. Harrison bounces around from shelter to shelter, and he always has a long story to impart. Malika sits across from me, listening with focused patience to Jerry, a retired electrician whose pants are held aloft with a set of elastic rainbow suspenders, as he describes the technical details of a recent repair. Next to me, the new computer programmer and his table mate have lapsed into a weighted silence that seems likely never to end. They sip their soup, staring straight ahead. The scene elicits a familiar feeling for me. 49% flight reflex, 51% tenderness. A not insignificant portion of me wants to run out the door, but keeping me in my seat is a warm wash of love for the people in this room. My congregants are often exasperating, unbelievably generous, reliably surprising, and very dear to me. And they keep coming back to do something that isn't all that easy, make halting conversation with a stranger, because there is something at these tables that's more important than being cool. So that's kind of setting the scene at St. Lydia's. And then I'm going to skip to the end of the book, kind of 3/4 of the way through. After we've grown and developed and begun to understand some of the complexities of justice issues in our neighborhood and the economic inequities and the racial inequities that plague our city of New York and Brooklyn. And this is about me learning to be someone who speaks out about racial injustice, which of course is such an important thing to be speaking about in this moment today in our history. The first time I preach about race at St. Lydia's, I tell a story from 3rd grade when my father came to visit my classroom. My teacher, a plump, smiling white woman who favored lacy blouses and calf-length floral skirts, stood with her back to us, writing up multiplication tables on the blackboard. She led us through them one by one, calling on students for the answers. Some, like me, sat with their hands raised high, confident that 2 times 2 equals 4. Others slumped at their desks with their heads propped up on a fist. She called on them too, but my dad noticed that she never called on the Black students, who made up 1/3 of our class. With each equation, kids' hands would shoot up in the air, but my teacher would only point to me or Sean or one of the Jennifers. It wasn't that the Black students received no attention at all. She'd chastise them to sit up straighter and stop fidgeting. I don't remember at what point in the year they stopped raising their hands, but I'm sure it didn't take long. By the time I reached 6th grade, I looked around my honors English class and wondered why, when so many Black kids attended our school, there were only 2 in my honors classes. One of them was Lamar Franklin. With round reading glasses, a bright smile, and an endearing gap between his front teeth, he was a charming kid, well-liked by everyone. Lamar persevered through teachers who wouldn't call on him and principals who spoke to him only to tell him to pull up his pants. But many others didn't. My public school was enacting the school to prison pipeline. I saw it play out right in front of me, but never knew it had a name. I tell the congregation this story. What kinds of lessons do you think I learned? I asked them. What assumptions did I inherit about who was smart and who wasn't? Who was good and who wasn't? Who was of value and who wasn't? All those lessons, never explicitly taught, but implicitly enforced, were engraved in my subconscious. Sitting at my desk with my pencil box and blue-lined paper in front of me, I learned an unspoken curriculum. I memorized the order of the planets and the life cycle of the butterfly that year, and soaked up the quotidian qualities of ordinary, small town, run-of-the-mill racism. I am shaking as I speak. The Lydians sit, nodding and wide-eyed. Perhaps they are sifting through stories of their own, remembering the advantages or disadvantages they received. After church, I go home and basically curl into a ball, feeling vulnerable and exposed. Words and I have never really gotten along. When I was a kid, talking to grown-ups or teachers, my words seemed to always get tangled up. I felt as if I was fighting a battle against chaos, trying to get them to line up the same way, always ending up tripping over them and blushing in class. When I reached divinity school, words had me convinced I could never be a pastor. I showed no promise in public speaking. My professor remarked in my evaluation that I seemed, quote, constantly surprised to find myself preaching. Things did not improve as St. Lydia's was getting started. Each Sunday night, those first few years, I would offer my sermon, rigidly reading from the pages I had written, never improvising. Standing up to preach has meant acquainting myself with a certain feeling of dread. Now, wading into preaching about racial injustice means acquainting myself with the suffering of the world and allowing it to do its work on me. My words aren't always graceful or eloquent. They lack the practiced flourishes of my divinity school colleagues. Instead, I figure the best thing I can do is just point to what I see and hope others see it too. Just uncover the truth we've all been avoiding. I have learned to wrestle with words. Some things are too important not to name.
Well, Emily, maybe I can sort of like kick off the next portion while we're talking about that. And you've talked about building St. Lydia's as a church. Maybe you can touch on, because probably several people haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but what it was like building that community. And you make it very clear in your book, of course, you don't look like a lot of your peers. You're not male, you don't wear a collar, you talked about the hanging around and making the big jokes about their families and things like that. So what's it like sort of building a community in that kind of bureaucracy, maybe dealing with issues, building a community in the neighborhood you're in, and then having to just deal with the humdrum bureaucracy of, your church, when things break down or when neighbors don't like your concerts and things like that. And I also love the fact that you talked about when you personally had to take a break. Maybe that's a good thing too to touch on for some of us as well, is that, while you're doing all of this and sort of building a community and being an activist, it's like, when do you yourself have to realize your own humanity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think, our systems elevate certain people who seem normative. And the more you fall outside those circles of normativity, the more weight you're carrying. And I carry quite a lot of privilege that allows me to function in the sort of normative circles in ways that have been beneficial to me. But also, there's other things like being a woman who's a church planter and being a young person in the church who's trying to do something different. And with each of those sort of differences, there's more weight that's kind of layered on you. So you can kind of measure that and think, well, what am I carrying here that others might not carry? And what are those around me carrying that I might not be carrying that I should, bear in mind and maybe try and ease some of their load a little bit. But being a church planter is such a fascinating experience, especially as a woman, because there's sort of these two paradigms for it, depending on which part of the church you're hanging out in. And I think in the sort of mainline world that I'm a part of, a lot of folks just don't even think about church planting. Like they think, well, we have a lot of churches and we have enough of them, so why would we need to start any more? So there's that kind of conversation to have, that churches have lifespans, and all of them were started at one point, even if it was 200 years ago. And some churches will come to the end of their life, and we need to be starting new churches that are responding to the cultural realities of this moment. So that's just kind of a fight to have the conversation over in the mainline world. And then over in the more kind of evangelical world, there's a lot of church planting, but it all kind of fits a model, which is generally like a young, charismatic, sort of straight, white, married pastor who has like a certain profile and does his work in a very certain way. And that's very different from the way that I do my work. So one of the things I wanted to explore in the book was the act of church planting as a sort of echo of the work that God does in creation, that God sort of nurtures and calls something new into being. And as church planters, we're doing very similar work, just as artists and musicians and writers are doing. We're kind of taking something up out of the nothing and sort of calling it into being and naming it and developing it. And then that's actually a very organic process, and in some ways a very feminine process. Yes, well, even though the models for church planting tend to be very masculine and talk about like building things and constructing as if we're kind of making it ourselves, which is interesting to me. So it was great to have a chance to explore that in the book. And I spend the second chapter on creation and this sense of void that, that something comes from. Just like at the beginning of creation, there's this tohu wabohu, this void at the beginning of time, of darkness and nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I did very much like how your book was broken down into the sections, you know, like creation, enough, justice, resurrection. It kind of seemed to take you on that arc through your memoir. And as I mentioned earlier, I really loved the fact that, you know, when you divided these sections, you used literary quotes. You know, there's one from Joy Harjo, Wendell Berry, Pablo Neruda, John M.C. Crumb, and George's own Flannery O'Connor, who was being as irreverent as she possibly could be about the Eucharist in her own way. Are you influenced by a lot of literarians and poets? And, you know, because I just found it very interesting that you chose these, and I truly loved the Pablo Neruda one. I just thought was so timely as well, because that one, if you all don't have the book, the quote that from Pablo Neruda that she used in the section is, "We will fight for you instead, side by side with others, with everyone who knows hunger." And they just seemed perfectly seated in the book as well.
I'm glad you enjoyed them. Poetry, it's funny to hear because at the beginning, as a writer, I did not have a sense of structure going into the book, and I kept kind of trying to impose structure on the book and kind of make an outline and get myself kind of organized. And one of my mentors said, you know, you need to write, like, don't impose order too soon. But part of the way that I did try and find my way to an order is that every chapter and section had all these quotes that were part of it, like constantly. So now the book has these kind of 4 sections that each have an epigraph at the beginning, but I had to pull a lot of them out. But I would say that those quotes kind of helped me figure out where the book was going and how it was structured and what I wanted to do. And they kind of were like lighthouses that I could like aim toward. Poetry is very important to me, and at St. Lydia's it was actually incredibly important and continues to be. We had a practice of choosing a poem every worship service that would kind of stand in juxtaposition to the gospel reading or whichever scripture reading we were reading that evening. And it was such a beautiful practice. The colleague and friend who I started St. Lydia's with, my collaborator, had a really just a wonderful gift for poetry and for choosing like the perfect poem for the moment and for the text. And it was just this incredible skill she had. And so we used to actually post those poems online so that people could read them. And all of them had this kind of spiritual resonance and beauty. So it was a wonderful way to bring other voices into our worship as well, from different times and different places. And I think that sort of, yeah, the sense of expansiveness that poetry creates was something we really wanted to find as a congregation, where you're not approaching the biblical text saying like, well, what does it mean and what should I do? But instead you're kind of bathing in the story of the text and bathing in the language of the poem. And that is a kind of evocative experience.
Mm. So that actually is, when you're talking of St. Lydia, is a great way to segue into this question that came through in the chat. And one of the folks wants to know, what led you to choose the community where you located St. Lydia's?
Oh, yeah, interesting question. So we started out as a congregation that was brought together because of mutual desire. When the congregation started, I was about 26 years old. And you'll read in the book that it really came together because I kept meeting other young people who were kind of looking for a spiritual community, but they weren't finding one. And all the options in New York felt either too politically and theologically conservative for them, or they felt like very formal, like kind of big steeple worship, which we have a lot of in New York City. And so they were kind of bouncing around looking for spiritual community, but not finding anything. And St. Lydia's was actually built for this community of people who were looking for a place to explore their faith and also explore their doubt. I think that many of them were kind of unpacking the faith that they had been given as kids and sort of wondering what their relationship with God looked like now. So we were not actually geographically focused for quite some time. We started off in the East Village and we worshiped in a church that opened their doors to us for about 2 years. Then we moved into another church and like that didn't work out because it turned out their building was falling down, and we like moved to people's apartments for a while. And then we rented space at a Zen center for a little while. And eventually we kind of set about searching for our home and started looking for a neighborhood that felt like it was a place where we could land. And we had some things we were looking for, like we wanted a neighborhood that was racially and economically diverse. We didn't want it to be located in a neighborhood that felt exclusively wealthy, where some people wouldn't feel comfortable. And we wanted to have subway access from multiple lines because we wanted lots of people to be able to get there. And also often on Sundays, one of the subways is closed. And so you need to use another one. So there were practical and also, I would say like philosophical, ecclesial considerations. And eventually we landed at this storefront in the Gowanus neighborhood, and the story of that neighborhood has become a very deep part of my sort of consciousness and bones. And I think wherever we live, knowing the story of the actual ground that you're standing on, it really shifts your relationship to the history of that place and the stories of that place.
Great. We had another question. Actually, we had a couple questions come through. So we're going to start with one from Nancy. And she asks, can you talk a bit about your own development and how you were drawn or called to be a pastor? What type of religious background did you have, and how did that influence how you became a pastor?
Great question. The book is very much about call and about responding to call even when it sort of scares us and makes us nervous and makes us want to run in the other direction. So that's a wonderful question because I thought being a pastor for a long time. I did not want to do it. I was raised very consistently in an Episcopal context growing up. I went to Episcopal church my whole life, and it was quite a progressive Episcopal church. Actually, my memory of church is that when I was about 14 years old, our cathedral, which is the church we attended, celebrated the first gay marriage in the Episcopal church. And we did so against the advice of our bishop. And the church decided that it was going to happen. This was before Gene Robinson. It was before there was any liturgy for marriage between gay folks in the Episcopal rubrics. It was just totally very early. And so my memories of going to church at that time were showing up to church and there were picketers outside and there were news cameras, and it was like a story for a while in the Seattle area where I grew up. And that's what I thought church was. Like, I learned through that experience that church is doing the thing that's right, even if there's not a structure or rules or guidance in place to sustain that. And there were many voices in our church that kept saying, well, we just need to wait until it's in the prayer book, or we just need to wait until the bishops like approve it, or until we have this language or these rules. And I remember my dad at the time very clearly saying, that's what they told us in the South about segregation. There was always a reason to wait. So that was my kind of context for church growing up. And it's a huge blessing. Now, as I have become more engaged in creating church for LGBTQ folks, and I'm part of that community, I realized what a huge gift that was to grow up in a context where there was not a sense of hatred for anyone's identity. It was just, a lot of people don't get that. So I feel very lucky. I then kind of followed this call to divinity school, all the while thinking, I'm not going to be a pastor, I'm not going to be a pastor. I was very interested in worship and the arts and music, and the idea of how you create transcendent experience for people through music and worship and the arts. And St. Lydia's, the idea to start this new church, kind of just grabbed me during my time as a young person in New York, and like wouldn't let me go until I started in on creating it. And so in some ways, the church actually taught me that I was a pastor before I had identified that need. And I started the church well before I was ordained, and then worked my way through the ordination process as the church was founding. So I had a very backwards process. But that's how it is with God sometimes.
So a couple more. Actually, I'm going to skip down one and then come back to the other one. So the question is, many churches struggle with even acknowledging the gospel relevance of social justice. But for churches that have made that leap, is there a witness role beyond conscious raising? And what should churches be doing this week?
Great question. Maybe you could ask Joe for a little bit of more information about witnessing, what you mean by witnessing versus conscious raising, and I can think on that.
Sure. That one actually comes from Mickey. So, if Mickey just wants to go ahead and unmute and give us a little bit of depth on that is what he's looking for. Oh, Mickey's unmuted.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. And yes, I grew up Southern Baptist, but I've learned a whole different term for way to think of witness. What is what is our testimony to the world in the way we speak, the way we behave, the way we stand these days? So no, this is not the witness that you remember from your childhood either.
Gotcha. I got it. Well, I really appreciate your question, especially about what we should be doing this week. And I think that we're all in process. And it's been very important to me in writing about the work that I've engaged in around racial justice to kind of try and be as naked as possible about the fact that I was just figuring it out and making a lot of mistakes and kind of bumbling along. And you heard a little bit of that in the reading. But I think often in our world, it can feel like you're supposed to have everything figured out and exactly right before you say anything. And while it's certainly not a great idea to kind of launch ourselves into conversations when we have no background or haven't done any work, we also kind of have to take a step forward and take risks, because that's how we learn. So from my perspective, I think that, it's a conversation of learning and trying and learning some more and continuing along the road, as opposed to getting paralyzed and stuck and thinking well, there's nothing I could do, which is an easy thing to do. I think for churches, the other piece of it is that it's holistic, right? It's not like we act one way when we're out in the street protesting or we're at the legislative offices asking for things, and then in our hearts or with our neighbors, we act differently. Like everything has to grow out of a sense of love for neighbor. And I think that work starts internally and then kind of shifts the way that we see the whole world. And relationships, like once we start building relationships with our neighbors, are transformative for us, transformative for our neighbors. And that will teach us sort of who to be and how to act slowly, but it will teach us. So a lot of the book is about how relationships sort of changed everything for me. This week, I've been thinking a lot about, sorry, I think my neighbor's been doing a little bit of construction. I hope you can't hear that. I've been thinking a lot about how it's important for our churches and for us individually to kind of go that one step deeper. It's great that we're kind of speaking out. It's great that we're maybe attending a protest or, you know, calling our representatives. And then I think the next step is to ask, like, how are our places of work and our churches and all the other structures that we're involved in participating in holding up unjust systems, and how can we start to take that apart? And I really think that in order to do that, we have to see a shift in how we spend our time and how we spend our money. I worked with a consultant once who told our church, our set of churches that were working with him, that if your budget doesn't change, then you haven't changed. And I think that's true for us individually and also as a church. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we raise more money. It might mean that we take money that we used to put one place and instead dedicate it to racial justice. So in my particular context in the Lutheran Church, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is our call committees and our call process for new pastors. Because our call committees often assume that a Lutheran pastor looks one way. Maybe they're blonde like me, or maybe they're from, you know, Minnesota. And when they encounter someone who looks different from me or who speaks differently from me, they don't think that person's a real Lutheran sometimes. And that gets transmitted and communicated in all kinds of ways. And lo and behold, Lutherans are the whitest denomination in America. There's lots of historic reasons for that, but there's also a reason that that's continued to be the case. So those are a few examples, I think, like starting to take apart some of those structures and actually shift the power balances would be the next step.
So there was another question that works really well with talking about community and relationships. And it's, the first reading evoked social roots of both Eucharist and being church. How will you deal with the new reality of physical distancing? What recommendations do you have for churches at any stage of their lifespans?
Oh my goodness, it's so hard. It's so hard. My whole life is about creating community spaces of connection and restoration and creativity and coming together and holding that space for people to be together. So for me personally, COVID-19 has been just a very difficult time because we can't gather, and it takes the wind out of our sails as a community, as congregations. So all of that being said, I think that I have discovered that there's a great deal of possibility online to connect with one another. And Zoom in particular is a great format because it allows us to connect and participate and be participative. I really believe that we have to think about this from the perspective of those who are most vulnerable, and make sure that if it's time to move back into our worship spaces and begin worshiping again, that we do not make them feel abandoned because they can't do that, and sort of leave them at home with no access to community. So at Dreams and Visions, the congregation I'm currently serving, we are fairly happy to stay online for quite some time. And we're also starting to shift into thinking like, well, we have worship online and we connect, and it actually has built intimacy for us in a lot of ways. We've been able to connect in new ways online, which is great. But we've been thinking like, well, what things could we do in the world to kind of bring, one of my congregants said, bring the church to the people, which I thought was wonderful. So we're thinking about the idea of doing, one of my congregants had a great idea to do a rainbow blessing booth for Pride. and to somehow to have like a booth that people stop by and that can be socially distanced to receive some kind of blessing. And we haven't figured out what that will look like yet. But I think this offers some creative ways that we can show up for other people. And I think that our worship can be our service during this time as well. There's a way in which God's kind of like turning the church inside out and saying, you can't be in this building, but you can be in the world. Even if you're stuck at home, you can be doing work for the world. So one thing that my colleagues and I have put together during this time is a project called the Farm to Stoop Project, where we've been buying produce from farms and distributing it to folks who are hungry here in Baltimore, of which unfortunately there are many. And it's been a wonderful experience to just, to be useful and to have time and energy to put into those projects. So I'd love to see the church turned inside out more. So that's some of what I'm working on.
Just real quick, because I do have like one great question I'm holding up for wrap up. But if anybody else has anything, if you want to type it into the chat, or if you just want to go ahead and raise your hand, we can recognize you and unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your question if anyone in the room has that. Give it a second.
Type in with one more thing, Joe.
Sure.
Going back to the question of like, what should we be doing this week? I think one thing that I didn't say, that I would be remiss if I didn't say, is that our work, if we are white, our work has to be rooted in work that's already taking place by our African American or POC siblings. So we don't want to just be kind of like doing whatever we want to do over here. We have to kind of figure out a way to anchor and to watch what it is that that people of color are doing and asking for, and then to respond out of that. Sometimes, white folks can kind of barrel in and mess things up, and it's not helpful. So that practice of listening and watching and learning is a huge part of the work as well.
So I guess the really great question to wrap up with from one of our folks is, what do you want readers to take away from this book?
Oh, that is a great question. My greatest hope writing the book was that readers would take encouragement to become involved in justice issues if they were not already involved, and to take heart and courage if they already were involved, to recommit and to continue to work. The book really follows my trajectory as someone who, thinks that racial injustice is bad and thinks that the world should be different in a lot of ways, but is not activated to do work in those areas. And in order to become activated, I needed to confess some things, and I needed to mourn some things, some of my own assumptions. One of the most important assumptions that I had to kind of look at and take apart and let go of was that I really did believe for a long time that I had everything that I had in my life because I earned it. And that is just not the case. I had a variety of privileges that all added up to an easier road for me. And it was a mourning, because that was part of my identity. Like, I really thought that, I was a really hard worker, and I am, but also I had an easier job all along. So my hope for the book is that we might kind of like unpack some of those stories, let go of some of that weight, because we've kind of looked truth right in the face, and get a sense of energy and motivation to approach the work with an open heart, I think. So I hope it carves out a path for people to move forward in their justice work and feel encouraged. And I also hope that it's a companion along the way.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much, Emily. Of course, right now, we all would be going to a book signing and forming a lovely little line to have copies of books signed. However, even in a global pandemic and doing things online, we are still able to do that. We have been working, as we have for years, with all the independent bookstores, and Little Shop of Stories is, of course, the bookstore for this evening. And you can go online to their website to order copies, or you could give them a call at 404-373-6300. Emily was shipped book plates earlier and signed book plates, and they're making their way to Little Shop. So you can get a signed copy of this. Little Shop of Stories is, of course, providing either mail service or curbside pickup if you live within walking distance and can go to the store and pick it up. They have a wonderful little shelf outside that they put the books on for that touchless service, given the global pandemic that we're living in. But it is also great to support our local independent bookstores. Wherever you are, please seek those out. Please seek out Black-owned independent bookstores wherever they are as well, and just support both communities, because I think that is the utmost importance at this time. Once again, thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your memoir and all these wonderful, wonderful bits of advice and knowledge with us. And thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you again to First Baptist. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you all again very, very soon. Good night.